This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest is Guillermo Periera, an energy policy researcher with the Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Guillermo's 12-year career has included work as an energy analyst and consultant in the UK, and as a clean energy researcher and consultant with, among others, the University of Manchester, Boston University, the Federal University of at Rio de Janeiro, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In this episode of the USEA Power Sector Podcast series on new utility planning paradigms, we're going to talk about the impacts on the power sector, variable and customer-owned energy resources, of rising demand, and of new policies. Guillermo is going to talk about where planning innovations like integrated distribution system planning are being used to optimize the delivery of reliable, affordable electricity. Guillermo, traditional planning processes seem to no longer be adequate to address today's opportunities and challenges. You've done important research on where new approaches are being tested. But before we get into those details, why is this shift in utility planning practices happening? In what timeframes do utilities plan? And what's the overall goal of bringing new approaches to the planning process?
No, thank you so much, Herman. Absolutely. Um, so let's start at the reason of why we are seeing this shift, and is we are seeing an accelerating pace of transformation in distribution system operations, and this is connected to a significant scale of investments required to address those changes. And I want to get into a few of the different factors under that transformation. One of them is technology adoption at the grid edge, and also grid modernization technologies in actual distribution systems. The other one is policies and regulations and what we are seeing there across a range of growing number of states. And then customer expectations as we navigate the energy transition. Those are also changing and evolving. Um, and I can dive a little bit into each one of those if that's helpful.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, when you think about technology adoption, I think this one is really increasing penetration of distributed energy resources, increasing load from electric vehicles, from heat pumps, from people interested in connecting distributed solar in front and behind the meter.
Mhm.
Um, and with this growth, there's also a growing interest in making sure that we are deploying and operating those resources in a way that adds value to both customers and the grid. And when I say this, for example, think about deploying distributed resources in a geo-targeted way that can address the grid need. And some utilities have implemented programs that address a specific location in their system that has a specific need, and they design a customer program around that. Um,
Yeah, that the idea of including these things into planning is so that utilities, whether it's in their 2 to 3 year short-term plans or their 5 to 10 year or longer planning, they can take advantage of these new resources that you've just described to not only to serve the customers, but to serve the overall system, right?
Absolutely, to serve the customer, to serve the system. And touching on your question about timeframes, I think there are uh, two different timeframes to consider. One of them is the frequency with which utilities have to file these plans with commissions. And that tends to vary between 3 and 5 years, in some cases 4, I believe. So they have to submit a new plan to the commission. It goes through the regulatory process, and that then supports distribution system investments and actions. And then there's the planning horizons that get included in distribution plans. And again, there we see variations. Some utilities look 10 years ahead, some utilities look 5 years ahead. Some states require utilities to look as far ahead as 2050. So
Mm.
there is a range into the how far into the future utilities look. But those two different time dimensions I think are important to keep in mind. How often utilities have to do the planning exercise, and that's helpful because that supports their strategic thinking for distribution system planning long term. And then how do they reach those conclusions, which is how far into the future are they looking?
Right. And those are that's very important when you get into how they do the planning. And you're going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes. But I just want to talk briefly about this key new approach to planning, which is the integrated distribution system planning, sometimes called IDSP. It's used alongside the more widely used integrated resource plan, or IRP. What are the many objectives that states and utilities expect to accomplish by bringing an IDSP along with an IRP? And have we seen impacts? Has this been effective yet in bringing customer-owned distributed energy resources, or DER, into the planning process?
No, that's an excellent question. I guess I'll talk about objectives first briefly, and then we can go into the
Good,
effectiveness of integrating DERs, distributed energy resources. So objectives can be varied, and they can encompass a variety of different priorities. I have a few examples of what states actually include in their requirements, so we can make it very real.
good.
For instance, objectives can be to improve grid reliability and resilience. And if you look at the requirements in Colorado, this is a quote, they mentioned that they will review and evaluate the utilities investments to ensure that they cost effectively support grid adequacy, reliability, and resilience. So you can see that theme of ensuring the system is able to be reliable and resilient. Another goal, for example, is to increase customer choice. And when you look at the language of the planning requirements in Minnesota, for example, they mention that they aim to enable greater customer engagement, empowerment, and options for energy services. So you have those explicit intentions of those goals there. And I guess I'll mention a last one before we dive into the second part of your question, which is, um,
What is it
oh,
getting? Has it been effective?
yes, in terms of has it been effective, I think it's important to point out that integrated distribution system planning is still new. Utilities have been doing planning for a long time, but integrated distribution system planning in these more open, transparent processes is still new. And I think it will take a while for us to see the full implementation of what utilities are proposing, but we are seeing results. And I have a couple of examples. We are seeing
Good.
non-wires alternatives being deployed as a result of the planning process. For example, in New York, utility Orange and Rockland is implementing a portfolio of energy efficiency in small businesses and third-party owned batteries to address a grid need. And that is an outcome of the planning process.
And let me just clarify, Guillermo, non-wires alternatives means that instead of having to build new transmission or distribution system, new poles and wires, they're able to use batteries and customer-owned solar and things like that, right?
That's correct. Exactly. The utilities go through the process of identifying grid deficiencies, so areas of the grid that need action. And some of them qualify for an unwires alternative, some others do not. And for the ones
Mhm.
that do qualify, um, distribution system planning is enabling and encouraging often non-wires alternatives to be considered. And various states have structured processes to go through that.
Interesting. Did you have a couple of other examples of where you've seen some results?
Yes, and the other example I was going to bring, and then I'll go into the part of DER integration, distributed energy resource integration, is that
Mm.
the example around stakeholder engagement and transparency is a core topic of integrated distribution system planning. So bringing more information, more transparently to more stakeholders. And we are seeing progress there. And one of the examples I wanted to mention is in Massachusetts, state law requires utilities Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil to submit their distribution system plans. They're called the Electric Sector Modernization Plans in this case, to a
Mhm.
Grid Modernization Advisory Council composed by a diversity of stakeholders, and then they are able to provide recommendations to the utility, and the utility has to respond to that. So it opens up the discussion, it opens up that conversation.
Interesting. So I want to point out to our listeners, I want to get into the, more into what you've been doing with your research on planning. But before we go there, I just want to point out to our listeners, you've mentioned states that aren't necessarily considered sunny states or windy states, or states that are interested in cutting edge things, Minnesota, Massachusetts, New York, but yet they're planning for customer owned and community owned resources to be a factor in utility portfolios. Now, that introduces whole new opportunity, but it also introduces some uncertainties. And your research has identified using scenarios to inform planning decisions and to balance risks and resource constraints that necessarily are going to come with uncertainties. So tell us, what is scenario planning? Why is it important when utilities are trying to look into the future and what their opportunities and challenges are going to be? And are we beginning to see utilities and system planners using scenarios?
No, absolutely. I think I'll start by providing some context of what scenario analysis is and why it's important.
Excellent.
Um, Scenario analysis is an approach to assess potential future plausible events. It's not predictions, but you are trying to understand what may happen in the future so that you, as a decision maker, in this case utilities, are able to inform the flexibility that you need on your plan. So you're not trying to get it right in terms of, oh, this is what's going to happen in 5 years, in 10 years, but this is what may happen. And it may be a range of potential future events. So that gives you that information to add the adequate level of flexibility. And this is important, as you were asking, because scenario analysis can help planners and decision makers understand how different future events may impact the timing, the scope, and the scale of different investment needs. So you are looking at potential plausible future events, and that informs what may be needed in terms of investments. And then you are able to scope your investment decisions and plan to address that. And I can speak about that a little bit more in detail because scenario analysis can support a few different functions within distribution system planning.
Right. Well, you mentioned different time frames for utilities, so I do want you to speak more about it, especially because you point out in your presentations that when you get beyond that shorter term, let's say 5-year horizon, you get more uncertainties, which really can be addressed with more scenarios. Is that correct?
Yes, as soon as you move into the anything over 3 to 5 years, and I mean, even sometimes forecast at the 3-year mark, you're dealing with uncertainty already. Outcomes may vary. But when you get into the 5 to 10 year forecast, when you're trying to plan ahead, it's hard to know the linear path that may happen. So that's when you need scenario analysis to help you mitigate some of that uncertainty to the extent that you are able and inform decisions and create options and understand no regrets investments to include in your plan and your investment decisions. Um, and I think something I'll mention, and
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll mention that scenario analysis can support a couple of different functions in the planning process. I think one of them is longer term and it's about strategic analysis. And the other one is closer to the near term needs of planning, which is on the forecast analysis front.
Mm,
And, and when you think about strategic analysis, scenario planning can allow utilities to explore plausible events, as I was mentioning, considering different factors that may impact the utilities' plans. And these may be direct factors such as load growth or severe weather impacts, or they may be indirect or less direct factors such as economic shifts and changes or technological factors on cost of technology. Supply chains can also be considered. You may remember, right, the transformer shortage that has been affecting and affected utilities significantly during COVID.
right.
So that can all be part of the strategic analysis part. And this can guide strategy development because you are considering the factors that may have different potential plausible outcomes, and you are using that to inform your longer term utility strategy for the distribution system. So that's part of the strategic analysis component. The other one, which I think is also very important, is that it can be a tool to stress test. So you
Yeah, I was going
develop
to
it.
ask you about that. You stress
Yes,
test plan to see exactly how effective it can be.
exactly. So you went through the planning process, you identified your investment needs, you identified your near-term and longer-term um, strategic goals, and now you can use scenario analysis to look at key drivers that may affect those near-term needs that you already identified. And for some locations, these are not common across all utilities, but it may include electrification and the pace of electrification. It may include in some locations data center and crypto-related load growth. In other areas, it may be about distributed solar and storage. And utilities can develop scenarios for their different key factors to identify no regrets investments, which in this case are investments that make sense in any scenario. So that those are your safe bets. Regardless of what happens into the future, those would be needed. But it also allows you, I think equally important is to identify scalable opportunities. So can you, based on the scenario outcomes you are seeing, plan for a gradual investment into a specific technology? And
Mm.
similar to that, I think, is the opportunity to identify on-ramps. So you didn't plan for a specific investment, but a certain scenario you consider now materializes. So now you have this on-ramp to start investing into a specific need. And the same goes for off-ramps. You start investing into a specific area of the grid, into a specific technology, but the future changed your needs. And now you are able to take that off-ramp and have that flexibility. And again, as I feel like I keep saying, it really informs the flexibility you need.
Interesting. Okay, Guillermo, I'm going to ask you one last question. It's a lightning round question. We don't have much time left. There, some of your reports have mentioned practices in Oregon, Vermont, Michigan, and Massachusetts as being really interesting examples. Could you pick one and just tell us why it's exemplary?
Yes, I'll do the lightning round. I think the one I have highlighted in previous work is DTE in Michigan.
Detroit
And
Energy, Michigan. Yeah.
exactly. And I like that example because this utility in Michigan and various utilities in Michigan have been undergoing distribution system planning efforts. And DTE has integrated scenario analysis in their latest distribution system plan. And they developed 3 different scenarios for high impact drivers. They look at high electrification of buildings, transportation, and industry. They looked at the impact of catastrophic storms into the electricity infrastructure. And they also look at the adoption of distributed solar and storage technologies behind the meter. And I like this example because it lives within distribution system planning. They did the plan, they consider scenarios, and then in their discussion of their plan, they weave the implications of having done scenario analysis, which I think pairs well with the planning exercise because you are informing the commission staff, and stakeholders on what scenarios actually mean for the actions you are taking and proposing.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad you picked that one. Again, a state, Michigan, that is not known for having a lot of sun, not necessarily abundance of wind resources, but a state that is nevertheless planning for an energy transition and planning for their utilities to accommodate it. So great conversation. My guest has been Berkeley Lab energy policy researcher Guillermo Periera. He's given us insights into the innovative concept of integrated distribution system planning as a way of including customer-owned distributed energy resources into utility planning to improve the delivery of affordable, reliable electricity. Thanks so much, Guillermo. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast, which, by the way, is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.